In today's video, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about how to grow great tomatoes in containers, and it all starts with choosing the right variety. So over here in my greenhouse, I've been starting seeds since winter time, and I have quite a few different options here. Now, when it comes to growing in containers, you are limited by the size of the container, your ability to support and trellis those tomatoes. So let's talk about the different types of tomatoes and which ones are going to be easier and which ones might be a little bit more challenging. When it comes down to it, the two most basic types of tomatoes that you will encounter are Determinate, aka bush tomatoes, and Indeterminate, aka vining tomatoes. A determinate tomato is growing until a determined period of time, at which point it sets all of its tomatoes pretty much at once. Not usually literally all at once, but maybe over like a month period. An indeterminate tomato grows for an indeterminate amount of time, so it could set fruit continuously. I've had them growing from March all the way out until November. They could get over 12 feet tall and even bigger if you let them. So those are going to be a little bit more challenging to grow in tomatoes because you're going to run out of space at some point, and the container is simply going to have a hard time holding enough water. Now there is another option which is very interesting called the dwarf tomato. These are tomatoes that are like indeterminates. They can make big tomatoes even. So the dwarf isn't about the fruit, it's about how it actually grows. These tomatoes will cap out at 5 to 6 feet. They'll have branching much more regularly than a standard tomato, which might have a branch like every 6 inches. They'll have a branch every 3 inches. So it's much more dense, easier to contain in a container, and that's probably going to be your best bet. We actually have an example of a dwarf sort of determinate tomato right down here in this grow bag, which I can show you right now. I believe it's called the Cherry Falls, and it's a yellow style tomato. So right here you could see it's setting a prolific amount of fruit. There are so many fruit branches and trusses, and it's very small for the amount of fruit that it's setting at this point. That is why it is semi-dwarf, and it's why it's very convenient for growing in containers. Right here I have them just growing in a 5-gallon bag. But how do you know what size container is best? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. Now that we understand the different types of tomatoes, it's perfect time to talk about what are the ideal container sizes for those. The patio choice tomato, which is the one that I showed you in the greenhouse there, is quite perfect in a 5-gallon bag. It's perfectly capable of setting a bunch of flowers, fruit, grow just fine, even in the smaller, limited amount of soil. So what happens when you go up in container size? Once you get up to 10 gallons, you do have physically more soil. And by having more soil, that means it's much easier to actually water. The more soil you have, the longer it takes to dry out. So if you have something like a 10-gallon bag, you could go watering every 1 or every other day. In the summertime, you for sure will be watering at least once a day. But the 5-gallon bag in the summer, you're probably gonna have to water twice a day if you want your tomato to truly thrive. That is why whenever I go up to a indeterminate tomato, I like to stick to a 15-gallon size. 15 gallons of soil is going to give you a lot of water buffer. It's going to allow that plant to go for many months without getting fully root bound, and it's just going to simply carry more nutrients in there as well. So 10 gallons is what I would choose for something like this determinate tomato, so something that isn't going to grow for too long and isn't going to get too ridiculously large. And then a 15-gallon bag is what I would recommend if you're going with an indeterminate tomato. Now let's talk about the different options of containers. The most popular, I'd say by far, is a grow bag for growing tomatoes. The advantage of using a grow bag for something like tomatoes is that they're very cheap to get a bunch of, they're easy to put away and store at the end of the season, and they actually are capable of breathing, which lets those roots really thrive. It's a lot harder to overwater your plants in these, but it can actually be very easy to underwater your plants. That's why when I am actually choosing a grow bag, I am choosing one that has a lined inside. This is actually our own Epic grow bags here. And what we've done is we've added a double liner to the top portion of the bag. This will keep the water in there. You know, like when you go water your grow bag and the water just spurts out the sides, that's not going to happen in here. It's actually going to be able to go down into the soil. Now, if you don't like growing grow bags for whatever reason, a plastic pot is perfectly suitable. The downsides of these is that if they get overwatered, it could be quite hard for it to recover because there is no breathing in here. There's no way for it to evaporate. It can only lose water from the top or from the plant taking it up. And then any extra water maybe will drip out the bottom. So these are cheap, but I find that they're a little bit more challenging than they're worth. And so that is why I prefer doing grow bags. So now that we understand the different container options, let's talk about what soil to use. In this video, we will be planting determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. I already have my determinate bag full. And when it comes to determinate tomatoes, you don't have to go too crazy with the soil. They're just growing for about 3 months, setting their fruit, and then they're done and you could reuse that soil for something else. But for indeterminate tomatoes that might be growing for something like 6 months, I like to go with the highest quality soil I could get. Locally, this is one of the options here, Edna's Best Potting Soil, but anything from Fox Farms is always going to be a good option as well. So when it comes to a 15-gallon bag, One of these 1.5 cubic foot bags of soil should be plenty. And now what you're looking for is really just a quality of soil. Something that you've used in the past that you've had good success with should be just fine for your plants. So all I'm going to do here is take this and flip it in to my lined 15-gallon grow bag. It's actually astounding how much soil 15 gallons truly is. So what I've done here is I filled it almost all the way to the top. And what I like to do with my Indeterminate tomatoes is actually top it off with some compost. So right here is some of my compost been saving up. And it doesn't matter if you put it on top. All of this is going to do is slowly feed your tomato plants through the season. It's also going to help retain some of that water at the top where it likes to evaporate the most. But we will be talking about fertilizing and mulching once we get these tomatoes in the ground. So we've got our pots full of soil. Let's get to planting. We have our containers full of soil ready to plant, so let's get right into it. The first one is going to be the Determinate tomato. I actually went out and purchased this one from the nursery this morning. And when it comes to planting tomatoes, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. I'd say for Determinate tomatoes, don't bother trying to go too deep. I know the classic example is that you should always plant your tomatoes deep as possible. I think you still get some benefit. In a container, it's not going to be quite the same as in ground. The nice thing about a container is that the soil will be much warmer all the way throughout. Whereas if you went too deep in ground, you could actually pot your tomato into very cold soil, which would slow its growth. So in a container, while you can go a little bit deep, I'm not going to try to bury any of these suckers that are down here. I want to keep every single branch on the Determinate tomato because a Determinate tomato is not going to set infinite branches like a Indeterminate would. So if I buried and removed some of these suckers down here, it would be literally removing my harvest later on. We'll talk more about that when we get into pruning, but that's all I'm gonna say about planting the Determinates. Now, for Indeterminate tomatoes, we're going to do a little bit of pruning here because I do want this to be a little bit deeper, especially since we have a bigger container. We could get away with planting it deeper and letting it root more aggressively. So I'm gonna trim off these lower suckers, and then now what I'm going to do is bury it up to this point. So this is our 5-inch pot. And I've been growing this tomato in this for not too long. So you could see that the roots are not fully wrapped around every part of the soil block here, but it is all the way to the bottom. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So I'm gonna go ahead and bury it right up to that first branch. Now with Indeterminate tomatoes, every one of these branches, if you remove them, it's not a big deal because they will keep going for an indeterminate period of time. So let's go ahead and put this so that it's slightly deep, but not crazy, nothing crazy here. One of the benefits of burying the tomato slightly deep too is that by burying it deep, you're giving it some anchorage. Now this stem is supported underground, it's less likely to flop over and it should be a slightly more robust, resilient tomato. That's all it really takes for planting tomatoes. So now let's talk about some companion planting options, fertilizing and mulching. When growing in containers, I do still companion plant, but I try to choose them very carefully. So I'll usually do like a dwarf marigold, or more often than not, I almost always just do an alyssum. These tend to not get very large. They tend to bush and trail out of the container rather than overtake the entire planting area. So what I'm going to do here is just come to the edge of the pot. I don't want to go right up on the wall, but just right on the edge there. I'm gonna put one on the Determinate tomato. The Determinate tomato is not gonna grow for that long, so I don't feel like it's going to outcompete it over the long run. Whereas with the Indeterminate tomato, I have no idea how long I'm gonna be growing this for. It could be 6 months like I mentioned, so I'd rather just leave it as a tomato at this point. Now, regardless of how I end up trellising my tomatoes, I almost always like to start every single one with a simple bamboo stake going right up against the main stem. This does a couple things. First of all, it gives you some guaranteed rigidity to this tomato plant. It also guarantees that at least part of that tomato is going to be growing straight vertical. Because a lot of times what happens is, even if you have a good trellis system, if you don't support your tomatoes at the early stage, they'll tend to like flop over to one side and then you have to battle to bring it back up. So I just always recommend starting with a bamboo stake at the beginning to make your life easy. So I have the stake in. All I'm going to do now is take a little bit of this cotton twine and tie it loosely with plenty of room here so that the tomato stem can grow and fill in that space over time, and just keep it attached close to this bamboo stake. So all this is really doing, again, is keeping that tomato vertical. It's not necessarily going to be the actual trellising solution, although you can do it with bamboo stakes, but you're probably going to need about 4 or 5 bamboo stakes to fully support a tomato like this. And actually, before I mulch or even tie this one up, let's talk a little bit about pruning. When it comes to pruning tomatoes, generally the one thing I like to do is prune any tomato leaf that's low enough that it's rubbing against the bottom. So this one here, I'm gonna go ahead and just prune off just like that. So now we have all the leaves off the ground. Let's go ahead and mulch it. For the bag over here, I'm gonna go ahead and use this garden straw. It's really nice stuff because it's easy to spread in containers. And all this is really going to do for us over this time scale is simply keep our watering needs a little bit lower. By having mulch here, it'll stop the primary evaporation from coming up over the top of the bag, and it should lock that moisture in for just a couple extra hours every day, maybe even get you from one day watering to every other day watering. For the 15-gallon grow bag, I'm actually going to be using one of our new products, which is a plantable fabric mulch that is basically just made out of a grow bag. So this is like having a grow bag go all the way around your plants. It's designed for the 15-gallon bags. So for this example here, I'm not even worried about these tomato leaves rubbing on the soil because they're not rubbing on the soil. They're just simply rubbing on more grow bag material. What this is going to do is provide me a mulch that I could use season after season. It should lock quite a lot of moisture in there, but it should still allow me to water from above just fine. So we have our primary support structure in, we have our mulch down. Now let's talk about finally supporting and trellising these tomatoes. When it comes to growing determinate tomatoes, cages are actually quite nice. Now tomato cages are something I almost never use in my garden because it's hard to find ones that will work for indeterminate tomatoes. But this is our new offering here. It's a square cage. This is going to be great for peppers, for eggplants, for tomatoes, specifically determinate tomatoes, because they're not going to get that big and outgrow my trellis. So this is a little bit tight for the 10-gallon grow bag, but since I'm growing a determinate tomato, it actually does fit totally fine. And it's nice and tight, which means that it's not going to tip over. And I'm actually going to have a lot of space here for that tomato to fill it out. So there's the first level. We'll slide on the second one. And this size cage, I don't remember how tall it is. I think it's 4 feet, is more than enough height for a determinate tomato. They're not going to really grow up much past this. Even if they do, they could just trail off over the top here, and that's totally fine for something like a determinate tomato. So there we go. That's all we have to do for the determinate. Now, over the course of this growing habit, all we're going to do is make sure that the branches are leaning on the edges here instead of flopping out. If the stem keeps growing vertically, we'll tie it to this bamboo stake, but we're not going to do any pruning of any branches, except unless maybe the tomato leaves look a little bit sad. And that's it for the determinate tomato. So now, how are we going to solve the indeterminate? There are quite a few options. So let me go grab a couple things and I'll show you what I like to do. The first example here is a similar 15-gallon grow bag with the fabric mulch, but this tomato has been growing for quite a few weeks now. And what I've done is, as you can see, I have the central bamboo stake to keep everything as vertical as I can. But once it starts branching like this one has, it's time for the cage to do its work. So this is a Texas tomato cage. That's the name of the company. These are really the only properly sized tomato cages in my experience for growing indeterminate tomatoes. They're big enough, they're strong enough because they're made out of steel, and it simply will outgrow this at some point, but even at that point, I could just get rid of the tomato and start a new one. So Texas tomato cage, probably your best bet for indeterminates if you want a pre-made product, but there are a lot of other options that are much cheaper. One of the things that I've done in the past for my container tomatoes is that I would build a simple structure just out of cheap wood. These are tree stakes with a 2x3. This whole build costs maybe like 12 or 15 bucks. And then you hang a net on it and you could put 4 tomatoes underneath it, 1 tomato every 2 feet. And all you have to do now is as the tomato grows, you simply take your tomato and you weave it underneath the net every once in a while. And what happens is that it gets all wrapped up in this net, and that's going to act as its support over time. Now, if you can't fold it through, you could also just tie it to the net using a piece of string, or you could use one of those pre-made tomato clips as well. This is a great way to grow a lot of tomatoes. Regardless of where you live, you don't even need ground to do it. I'm just putting it here for an example. You could put these in like a bucket of concrete and build a simple little structure to put all your tomatoes underneath. So nets work great. But there's also the string method, which I could show you with some that I have in ground. So similar to the grow bag placed on the net, you do need a structure for this one, but once you have that structure, you could tie a string to it, drop it down to the ground, and either staple it into the ground or bury it. And then as your tomato is growing, all you're going to do is take your plant, wrap it around the string, and that's how it's going to be supported for its entire growth. Now, the downside of this is that you could really only support a single branch on a single piece of string, so you do have to be on top of pruning and removing suckers, or else the whole thing will break because this string can really only hold 1 branch at a time. So now we've covered a couple trellising options, and I wanted to actually circle back to something I forgot to mention, which is fertilizer. Fertilizer is actually something I would say is basically required for growing tomatoes in containers. Remember, these are limited to whatever nutrients are in that soil in this container, and that is it. They don't have access to anything else. They can't just keep sending roots into the earth looking for more nutrients. So what we're going to do is take some organic, slow release fertilizer. Basically, all granular organic fertilizers are slow release because they're basically made out of ingredients that break down into nutrients over time. Then I'm going to just sprinkle it across the top here. Brand doesn't really matter, honestly. Just go ahead and try to find a good organic one that you like. And then what I'm going to do next is simply scratch it into the surface of the soil a little bit, because we don't want it sitting on the top. We want it mixed into the soil so it can break down, get hit by water, and incorporate itself into the soil. So once we do that, we could go ahead and add our mulch back on. That's the nice thing about this. It's very easy to just sort of remove and mess with the soil, and then we could water it. So at the beginning, when this is still dry, it will sit on the surface a little bit more, but once this gets the water into it, it will now start actually draining deep into that soil. So that's it for the fertilizer at the beginning. We'll talk a little bit about mature plants, but now let's do this one. Same idea. Determinate tomatoes also need fertilizer, maybe not as much as an indeterminate, but they definitely will benefit from it as well. Now you can add too much fertilizer, and if you do add too much fertilizer, what will happen is you'll end up with aphids, you'll end up with a lot of leaf growth, and actually less fruit. So don't go crazy on the fertilizer. A little bit at the beginning is great. And then I'll show you what I like to do to my tomatoes once they're established inside my greenhouse. We now know how to start growing tomatoes in containers and get them established, but what do you do once your tomato has actually begun to grow? So first of all, let's talk about fertilizer. When it comes to an established plant, I like to use a liquid fertilizer. So right here, this tasty brown shot of liquid Joy is full of delicious nutrients for this tomato. So I'm gonna just drop it into here. It could be any liquid fertilizer, honestly. It doesn't have to be one that says tomatoes. It could just be an all-purpose or plant or fruiting, whatever, it doesn't matter. So I have it mixed into my water. All you need to do now is take this, come to the base of your plant, and you'll see that wonderful color of the water turn brown, and just give it a nice healthy dose all the way around. Just follow the instructions on the bottle, and this is going to give nutrients to this tomato right away. So it doesn't have to wait for all those organic granular fertilizers to break down over time. It could simply pull these nutrients straight out of the water, and it will sit in the soil as well for a little bit of time to feed this plant over those coming days. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what you're looking at here is that I originally had a small trellis that has very much so been outgrown by this tomato. So now I started adding stakes. I have a bamboo stake there. I have another stake there. I'm just tying off whatever I can to whatever's around it. So when it comes to trellising tomatoes, you could get crazy with it. I'm going to keep adding bamboo stakes into this until I feel like I got enough tomatoes. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is you'll notice that at the lower part, there's basically no leaves left, and that's totally normal. This is what happens to a tomato as it gets old. The leaves start to get disease. I can actually see some right here. I have a little bit of powdery mildew. It's these little white dots that appear on the leaf. This will eventually overtake the leaf, stop it from photosynthesizing, and the plant will slowly start to die. The basic idea is that once a tomato cluster has set fruit, all the leaves below it are probably going to get removed because they're old and they're going to be more prone to disease. So that's the basic idea of why this looks the way it does. Now let's talk about watering. Once the plant is this big and it has this much fruit, you will have to water it every single day. If you do not, what you'll end up with is blossom end rot. So a lot of people will take their hose like this and maybe do like 5 seconds of water. That is not enough water. You want to put this on here for at least 10 to 15 seconds, maybe even 30 seconds, maybe even until water is coming out the bottom of the bag. In the summertime, when you have a plant with this many leaves and this much fruit, it's going to just simply need a lot of water, which is why I said at the beginning, you want to go with a bigger bag so you don't have to water quite as often. But that's basically it. Prune any old leaves to allow airflow, make sure you're feeding it over time, and you water it plenty of water, especially once it's fruiting and you're into the depths of summer. Now you know everything you need to know about growing tomatoes in containers, but if you want a full guide on pruning, check out this video over here. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.